yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today, because today we're dabbling in the horror genre. You know, it's a horror story first, horror forward, as they say, with a little bit of historical fantasy. What do they call that in like a tasting notes? You know, like a little aftertaste on the palate of
a reduction.
Of historical fantasy, you know.
It's horror with a fantasy reduction.
It's got notes of fantasy within it. And we are, of course, talking about Between Two Fires.
I don't know what a reduction is. I just know from American Psycho. So it's like a...
See, a reduction's not a tasting note. A reduction is like a sauce or like a food that has been reduced in a hot pan to remove moisture out of it, so it becomes a bit more syrupy or a bit thicker in consistency. But it's not a tasting
Chef Charles
note.
In the house.
I know, right?
That is something you'll only get from a man who has served food to Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis.
Right? We're coming back to that.
You can tell which one of us has done that based on which one of us knows what a reduction is.
We did not serve any reductions at Dat Dog, but
you didn't have like sausage.
We did have
with
playful little dishes, though. We did have that. Even if the New York Times wouldn't say it. But we're here today to talk about a different horror story that's not American Psycho. And I actually think in American Psycho 2, Mila Kunis starred in that. So there's a bit of a connection here.
There's an American Psycho 2?
Starring Mila Kunis, I'm like pretty sure.
Wow.
I've never seen it. I don't think anyone's seen it, but...
There was an American Psycho musical that had a brief run on Broadway that I saw.
I'm sure it was excellent. I remember you went to see that. Yeah, American Psycho 2. It has Mila Kunis and William Shatner in it. Wow, what a cast!
What a crew!
And that brings us between the horror, the Mila Kunis, the American Psycho. We're back to Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman. Now, this was one that Dylan and I had pitched to you way back, and in our last Friends Pitching Fantasy, you did not select it. What did you select instead? Oh, yeah, Gideon the Ninth, which we just did a wonderful episode on. A different kind of horror-ish story, I would say.
Gothic horror.
But Gothic horror, yeah. But this one is definitely more traditionally rooted in horror. And I'm excited to get into it. And one of the things, like when you picked Gideon the Ninth, I was very excited. Obviously, it was by far the most popular choice, and it's definitely the most popular in popular culture and all of that. So I was super excited to get into that. But it left me feeling like, man, when I was pitching Between Two Fires, I was getting fired up myself, on reading it. Yeah, it was one of those ones that I was just super excited about. So I would audiobook Gideon the Ninth, and then I would read Between Two Fires as a way to kind of get both going. And now I have read Between Two Fires. Dylan, you have not. So I'm here to give a little spoiler-free discussion of Christopher Buehlman's, I believe, second release, his horror-forward novel. And I have a lot to say about it, so I'm excited to get into it.
I'm sure you do. We're both huge fans of Christopher Buehlman's fantasy debut, The Black-Tongued Thief. We read that, probably a year and a half ago or something like that at this point.
It was earlier this year. We read it in like January.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah, now I'm remembering.
Because it was in one of my favorite books that we've read this year over at
which you can
SFF
check
podcast.
Out on SFF
Spoilers
Addicts
for that
podcast. Yeah, I mean, you'll have to check it out though to see the books chosen by 2 other books chosen by Charles, 3 chosen by me, 3 chosen by author of Among Thieves, MJ Kuhn, and of course 3 chosen by Adrian Gibson over there. Those 2
podcaster extraordinaire,
SFF Addicts. Yeah, podcasters, both extraordinaires, and we got we got really into the Black Tongue Thief in that deep dive spoiler filled episode we did about a year ago. And what a joy, a novel filled with humor, also grimdark. It kind of is one of the few books that finds that Abercrombian balance between humor and grimdark. There's only a couple authors, a handful, if you will, who I would say are really capable of that I've read. Of course, Abercrombie, and the person that I kind of consider the master of the humor grimdark balance. Then there's Ed McDonald. He does Blackwing and the rest of that trilogy that was... I believe I pitched that to you, Charles, in the Friends Pitching Fantasy. You did not select it, but that's a great grimdark humor balance. And then, of course, we've got Christopher Buehlman. Sounds like this is different tonally from the Black Tongue Thief. Between Two Fires seems a little bit more play it straight. And... I'm curious what kind of differences you saw between the two books, because fantasy fans are probably more familiar
between
with the Black
two books,
Thief.
Between two fires. So
between two ferns.
And I think a lot between two great web series for sure. It was interesting because earlier this year, at the very beginning of the year, like you said, we read Black Tongue Thief, and what's interesting is that was our introduction to Christopher Buehlman. But he's already been an established author in the horror genre, and he's already also been an established playwright, a strong presence in Renaissance fairs as a professional insulter, and he's in a traveling troupe and all of these things. So it's kind of funny. Normally I like to experience an author from the beginning and watch their work kind of progress. But we're kind of doing this in reverse with Buehlman. I find myself learning more about him as I'm going backwards, right? So what's interesting about Black Tongue Thief is that was his first fantasy book, and I would also argue it's his most successful work to date, just based on critical reception and popular reception. And maybe that's just because we're in the fantasy world, so it's just made huge waves for us. But it feels that way. And I think on Goodreads and stuff, it's got the most reviews and all of this stuff. But it pulled us in right away, like you said, Dylan. And the thing that jumped out, obviously the grimdark influence, the calls to Scott Lynch and the calls to Joe Abercrombie and the praise from Nicholas Eames and Robin Hobb and all of these huge names just praising the book. We were super excited to get into it, and it was excellent. And his voice, not just in the audiobook, which he narrates and performs, I would say. It's not just him doing his voice, it's him performing a character. So not just that voice, but actually the voice of his writing style is what fascinated us from the beginning. And we both knew that we were absolutely fascinated by this guy and super appreciative of his works. Wholly original, yet hitting those particular tropes that we like. And it was his horror influence that brought a really interesting flair to Black Tongue Thief. And now what's interesting is it's what is the difference between a fantasy book with horror elements and a horror book with fantasy elements, right? So it's kind of doing a little switcheroo with Between Two Fires, which is Christopher Buehlman's second book that he published, because he did Those Across the River, which is another genre-bending Southern horror book, which I'm definitely going to read at some point because I'm just a huge fan of Buehlman now. But Between Two Fires made the most sense for me because it had the knights and angels and demons, and it was more rooted in fantasy. So definitely thought, hey, let's give this one a try next. And it's like you said, Dylan, it's definitely a more serious tone. I think Black Tongue Thief, it was unabashed, let me just go all out with this character who's a bit of a roguish type, who has a twisted sense of humor, and let's just lean into the absurdity of the story. Let's have some fun with it. And Between Two Fires, there's occasionally humor in it, but it is a very miserable setting, so no one can truly be happy in this book. So it's just kind of it's very much rooted in misery, and there's a lot of horror that happens in this book. So it's a much more serious, that gives it a more serious tone. But then with that, Buehlman, I think, is very smart, where he's okay, this is a more serious book, more serious subject matter. I'm going to just focus on telling prose that you could probably read right out of the Bible or some Renaissance sermon or something like that. And he just leans in on that, and he delivers like with insane writing chops in this, that it just gets you pumped up reading it. It's just like a whole nother level. So not as like funny and creative and zany off the wall ideas and thoughts and stories, but just as much talent and focused energy here that the reading experience of it, his voice continues to shine, even though he's doing it in a tonally very, very different. I mean, he's obviously a fantastic writer, and that was kind of what made me want to try the book. And I can say for anyone that's interested, he delivers 100%.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I was curious about the element of humor or lack thereof in Between Two Fires, because he's so funny, right? And a guy who's a professional insulter at Renaissance fairs.
Right.
You know, you'd almost be remiss, you'd think, not to include that humor in this. But at the same time, horror, it can be such a delicate balance when it comes to humor, because it can undercut the tension, and tension is so critical to a horror novel of any sort. I mean, occasional comic relief can help, but when you compare it to The Black Tongue Thief, which is just the character who's basically narrating the story of The Black Tongue Thief is just a very funny guy and makes a lot of humorous observations just in the telling of the story. And Buehlman is so tight to that point of view. But so you couldn't make it not funny with that guy telling the story. But this one, it sounds like, focuses more on the prose. Is it third person point of view, or is it first person?
It's third, I think.
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, he did this, he did that.
Yeah.
You know, the main character did this. So, because it's almost told like you would read, as like, and lo unto thee that he did this crazy thing. You know, every once in a while it will get like that. And yeah, I would say, Christopher Buehlman, this may be because it's an earlier work, but he takes it very, very seriously. Where I think in Black Tongue Thief, he brings in that same high standard of artistic integrity, but doesn't, and takes the writing seriously, of course, but the actual subject matter and like what he's writing, he's not taking seriously at all. He's having fun with it, and he's like leaning into the absurdity and into the fantasy genre a lot more. But in Between Two Fires, it's very serious throughout. I mean, he does tell a few jokes. Like, the story takes place in France, but there's one time where they're going into Florence, and it's the plague, right? So there's lots of dead bodies. And so this idea of, they were describing like mass graves with like, you have lots of corpses and then dirt and then more corpses. And then it's, they developed this phrase, oh, they've gone to the lasagna. Like, they've just been buried in this layered mass grave. So he injects humor in it at some points, and they like have moments where they're eating together and they're having a good time, and
hopefully not,
and they're
lasagna.
Joking with each other. But those are glimmers, because the setting is really, really grim, like near the end of a Black Death plague that has just absolutely ravaged the world that they live in, and there's nothing that hasn't been affected by this plague. They'll go into an abandoned house and there's just corpses everywhere, like a corpse in the bed that had died, or a corpse leaning over a fence that had died. So there's lots of those depressing scenes here, and I think Buehlman wanted to take that subject matter very seriously, because a whole part of the story, and I'll get into the story, actually, I should probably read the synopsis, but the whole plot of the story is about redemption in the face of just being basically abandoned by God. It's like, how can you even redeem yourself at that point? How can you go on at that point? What's even the point, And so just testing the characters in this really tough setting, I think the choice to keep the tone very serious was a really smart one and a really successful one.
Yeah, it's hard to make the Black Plague funny. It's, I mean, I listened to a podcast discussing it a while back, and then I was like, just stunned by the percentage of people who died in Europe during that time. Like a quick Google search now says that it killed 30 to 50% of the entire population of Europe. I mean, so walking around there, that is going to be a just abysmal place to be. It's hard to even imagine, like, literally 1 out of 2 people or 3 people that you know is dying. So we've got this extremely dark setting. Charles, should we get into the subject matter by reading that synopsis then?
Yeah, sure. I'll just kind of read the back of the book synopsis to give us a level set here. The year is 1348. Thomas, a disgraced knight, has found a young girl alone in a dead Norman village, an orphan of the Black Death and an almost unnerving picture of innocence. She tells Thomas that plague is only part of a larger cataclysm, that the fallen angels under Lucifer are rising in a second war on heaven, and that the world of men has fallen behind the lines of conflict. Is it delirium or is it faith? She believes she has seen the angels of God. She believes the righteous dead speak to her in dreams. And now she has convinced the faithless Thomas to shepherd her across a depraved landscape in Avignon. There, she tells Thomas she will fulfill her to confront the evil that has devastated the earth and to restore to this betrayed, murderous knight the nobility and hope of salvation he long abandoned. As hell unleashes its wrath and the true nature of the girl is revealed, Thomas will find himself on a macabre battleground of angels and demons, saints, and the risen dead, and in the midst of a desperate struggle for nothing less than the soul of man. So that is quite a synopsis.
Yeah, that's some heavy subject matter that Buehlman is approaching there, and definitely some big themes, it sounds like, are being explored. Has some Last of Us vibes, it seems like.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's a trope that I find myself actually enjoying quite a bit, where it's like older, like not disenfranchised, but like disillusioned, kind of grizzled, older parental, not seemingly parental figure, takes on a parental role to a much younger, innocent person. Like, I think of Geralt and Ciri in the beginning of the Witcher series too, where he's like pretty much at the end of his witchering days, and then he meets Ciri, and there's something that compels him to protect her, and like they develop almost like a family bond, and that's a very similar relationship dynamic that you get here, and it's just fun to watch like that stone chip away at the heart of someone who's like seen it all, super experienced, knows better than to let himself love someone, right? And then still just being in the presence of someone so innocent, it still chips away at them. And that's a really fun dynamic for two characters leading your story that I found that I enjoy.
Yeah, a tried and true trope, for sure. It's one that, I mean, even The Mandalorian has some elements of that as well. Maybe a little bit different in the way that it's executed, but I'd say at the heart,
very close.
Yeah, at the heart of that trope. So we're naming some hugely popular things here. I mean, The Witcher, The Last of Us, and then The Mandalorian. So there's something about this that is definitely working for people, and it sounds like that's at play here in Between Two Fires. But there's also the like big picture stuff that he's tackling here, the questions. I mean, I read some of the Wikipedia page of it as someone who hasn't read the book. I avoided the plot section because I do want to read this one, and I don't want any spoilers, but I did not avoid the 1-sentence or 2-sentence major themes section, which it says Jason Gollum. I don't know. It's weird to say Gollum in any sort of, it's Golomb, and I don't know what else I would say, but it's amazing if someone writing about something that's like borderline fantasy novel has the last name Gollum. But Jason Gollum wrote that redemption and renewal are major themes of the novel, and it also explores questions of why God allows disasters such as the Black Plague to occur. I mean, Buehlman is really getting in there with some big picture stuff, and it just explores. it sounds like he is really tackling some stuff that
To his
is
credit, he takes them on directly,
yeah.
which is like very ambitious. Like the whole premise of the book is super ambitious. It's like struggling for the soul of man, you know? It's like it doesn't get
Right.
kind of more primal than that, for sure.
Right. And how did you feel about the way that he got into that? Like, was it really interesting philosophical
Yeah.
musings about it? Did he do a good job of making the characters like real while also, because that's a thing that can happen is sometimes when someone's got these huge points or at least questions that they're trying to answer or explore, the characters can become like mouthpieces. Like,
Mhm.
did you find, I guess, like, did you find it satisfying his exploration of these questions? And then B, do the characters maintain their, I'm going to try this, Charles,
Mm.
verisimilitude, I believe is the word,
Oh.
right? There we go.
Their verisimilitude.
It's something,
Wow.
yeah, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Verisimilitude. I think
The
there's a
appearance
sneaky
of
eye in there.
being true or real.
Yeah. Verisimilitude. Okay, there we go. That's a good one, right? Do
That's a
they
great one.
maintain their verisimilitude
Great
despite?
questions. And
Yeah.
I can tell all our listeners today that the exploration of themes of redemption in this story and using religion as kind of and horror combined as a way to push that is explored masterfully here. Like I was
Mhm.
so impressed, and I don't read a whole lot of horror, but when I thought about it, I'm like, this is a great way to test someone's resolve. And when you think about redemption as like there's a maybe is there a price you have to pay to be redeemed? Do you have to suffer to be clean? You know, a very Catholic kind of view of forgiveness, right? Where it's like you go to hell and then you're forgiven, you know, or something like that. And it's like is that like a thing? Like is it reasonable for God to do that to humanity? And then does that mean that you can be redeemed, and at what price do you have to pay, you know? And it's explored so well, and the ending is to me my favorite part of the story. Is so powerful where Buehlman really tests the limits of his characters and his setting and of his use of religion and horror as thematic elements and puts them all together to really push this idea of redemption and can our main character be redeemed? Can the world be redeemed? Because so much of the story, it's told almost like an Odyssey where there's also almost like, you know, they form bands of unlikely people every once in a while as they like the whole thing is them traveling from one place to another because the the girl is emphatic that they have to go to this place, and so they're going, and they just get into, I'm going to call them adventures along the way, but this is a horror story, so they get into like horror stories along the way, and they're all kind of episodic in what happens. They go to a new place,
Mhm.
there's new characters, something horrific happens, and then they go to the next thing. Sometimes it's like an epic monster battle, sometimes it's like a psychological scary story, like you know, fireside scary story kind of thing. So there's a lot of that, and the book is actually rather long because it's doing this a lot, and they're just traveling around, and you know, there's elements of demons kind of being around the world, and then also it's just as scary to have people who are kind of profiteering off of the plague, and you know, all, and then people who, like, it seems like the only people that are surviving are just the most horrible people, and all of this stuff. And so it gets kind of shown and explored
Mhm.
throughout, but it's really at the end where it is tested and it is kind of like reflected on, and to me it was very powerful. You know, I was like, man, he went there really far with some of his characters, and I really appreciated it because it can be very ambitious to pull on religion and to play it straight, and you know, that's what he did here. And it can be kind of tired. You know, religion is a tricky thing in this day and age because so many people are like anti-religion or super pro-crazy religion, and it can be kind of hard to find someone who's just kind of neutral about religion and is willing to write like a story without commenting on like the church, which he still does, but in like the 1300s church, but he's more pulling on it as inspiration for the themes, and he does it super well, and it was really fascinating to read, honestly.
Yeah, that's definitely hard to find. You think of these stories that draw from religious elements typically as having a point in terms of a clear side of like pro-religious or anti-religious in this day and age. So that the Wikipedia article used the word explore, which is always a good sign for me, is like I don't enjoy as much when it's very clear that the author is like trying to convince you of their side of things. Like I like it better when it is just kind of like, well, like let's get into this, and there aren't always clear answers, but let's speculate a little bit. It seems like you said it's episodic in nature. That also sounds Witcher-like to me in terms of those short stories that the first book of the Witcher ends up using as a device. The first and second book of the Witcher series do that, and or as the kids would say, it's giving Witcher. You know that, Charles? You know that you know all about that?
No.
They don't say vibes. They just say like the new slang is like it's giving insert. Like it's giving Witcher.
We're
but not like the way we'd say.
I like vibes.
Well, I think they still say vibes in other circumstances. Like not that I'm the expert at any of this, but I think they might say like that guy has bad vibes or something. But when they're saying like it's giving, we might say like, oh, this is giving me Witcher vibes. They would just say it's giving Witcher. That's what they would say. Yeah. So yeah, this sounds like it's giving Witcher, and in a lot of ways using horror elements, which I don't feel like are super strong in Witcher, and also taking on some big picture questions, which Witcher does as well in exploring. We did a whole episode on what makes a monster, which is a pretty big question as well. So it's ambitious of Christopher Buehlman to take all this on and to do it in an episodic way, but also to tie it all together in a way that sounds satisfying. Like it sounds like the ending ties all of these potentially separate feeling episodic moments into one satisfying conclusion. That it sounds really impressive.
Right, exactly. And it's because the whole thing is rooted in redemption ultimately, and you can use religion as a tool of that. But even Buehlman was very smart to be like, okay, well, he talks about, like, there's a quote where they're dreaming of this ideal future. It's like a world where God's love was unfiltered by priests or texts and could be had freely by looking up at the sky, So there is these elements of, hey, like, there's something thematic about just the existence of God that you can lean on to explore redemption. And so this main character, he is a knight who is totally disenfranchised, and, he's in a super religious society, and he's also super disenfranchised by that. And he has every reason to be, because anywhere you go, someone's trying to cheat you or kill you or could get you sick, and you just have to be on your guard all the time. And he's a character who cares for this little girl, but also as they're traveling, he has to like kill people to save her, and he has to think poorly on people in order to like stay on guard and stay on edge and survive in this world. And so he's constantly at war with that of like, how can I protect people and also kill people and also expect like salvation? And that for the longest time throughout the book is totally disenfranchised him, yet he's traveling with someone who firmly believes in doing only good all the time, and that God's real and coming back and all of this other stuff. And so he's like trying to believe it, but like practical nature is causing him to continue on. And then it just raises the question of like, what is redemption? How does one redeem themselves? What price do they have to pay? Can anyone be redeemed, even in these horrible, horrible settings that they're in, and where you have literal demons like coming down and messing with people and like taking over people and stuff like that. Every horrible thing they could think to do to humanity. So it's like, what is the other side of that? And like, how can you overcome it? And it's like I'll say like the solution, which is the ending of the book, is a super interesting and thoughtful one in that. But I don't know. It's one of those things where it keeps you thinking about it, and there's so much rich thematic stuff to get into that would be spoiler filled. But I think it's important to think about, because you talked about it's episodic, and it is, and there is that entertainment value to it as well. So it's because it is, after all, a horror novel, and my experience with horror is pretty limited, but you still need those stories. I think of like Edgar Allan Poe, like, like Castle of Amontillado, Telltale Heart, whatever, where it's like those kind of stories are happening throughout. So there is that entertainment value. And let's be real here, there are like angels and demons, and they're fighting each other, and there's also supernatural crap, and there's cool monster battles and all this other stuff. So Buehlman delivers, but I don't know. I'm just very impressed with how seriously he took everything and like delivered, and had the writing chops to back it up. So I had nothing but respect for this story, and then the fact that I was entertained by it as well was just a nice added bonus. It's just so good. Like, I have so many things highlighted that I just was like so impressed by. It's just a totally different writing style than I'm used to. It's so serious, but yet so entertaining at the same time. It is almost like poetry. You can see his poetic and his playwriting background really influence the voice of the story, because it is very like theatrical in its presentation.
Yeah, I'm sure you came away with a lot of fantastic quotes from this one, and that's on that. You said you read on Kindle, right? Am I?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's one of the nice things about reading on Kindle is you can highlight and just go back to a page that has all of them, and it's too bad we don't have the chance to get into a spoiler-filled discussion where I'd have read the book too. We can get there, I'm sure, eventually, but I'm sure it would involve a lot of reading of awesome quotes. You mentioned that it's a very different tone and a very different writing style than you're used to. Obviously, we read a ton of fantasy on here, and this could, like, the premise of this could easily be a fantasy novel or a historical fantasy novel, but it sounds like the writing style and the tone, because there's always this like weird, not entirely arbitrary line, but like hard to determine exactly where it is line between horror and fantasy, and it sounds like it's the tone then mostly that you would say makes this horror. Like, where are you coming, having read a fantasy book by him and a horror book? Because you talked about the idea of differentiating between fantasy book with horror elements and horror book with fantasy elements. Where are you coming down on the difference between those two?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing it comes down to is the subject matter. Like, there's so much focus on, and then they went into this house and it appeared empty, and then they went in and they saw the corpse there, and then like overnight it this like the stuff that happens is significantly more horrific. There's some horrific stuff in Black Tongue Thief for sure, but it's all here and then some in Between Two Fires. So I definitely think for most of the book, he's trying to put you in a mood and give you like horror vibes. And I think that's part of the episodic nature of like the 75% of this book is trying to do. So that is the first area. I think that's the focus. And the second is like the story itself is not a fantasy at all. It's like when I think of like a fantasy novel, there seems to be more of, I don't know, magic, missions, quests. None of that's really here. There's religion, and there's certainly like fantastical elements of that, but it's more like I'm picturing. Did you see the movie like The Witch or something like that? Where
I did not.
ooh, The Witch is a fantastic horror movie, but it just takes place in like pioneer times, you know, and the language is old timey, and it's just a family trying to survive in the middle of nowhere. And things get a little weird and wild and horrific while they're trying to do that. And it's a very similar thing with this story. So I definitely think it's the focus on like telling these horror stories throughout is the biggest piece. And then I don't know. It's definitely. I would say that's the biggest thing, because you could like fantasy. The great thing about it is you could inject it into a lot of different stuff and call it fantasy. But I would definitely say that with the Black Tongue Thief, there was, you know, thieves guilds and wizards and swords and shields and towers and like all this other stuff. And in
towers.
Between Two Fires, you are in the world.
Once you got towers in there, it's fantasy.
Yeah, sprawling towers.
Well, if you have 2 or more towers, that's what you get.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, towers are very fantastical for sure. Like,
there's Babel, the tower in Seven Sins, and
yep.
I'm sure many other towers as well.
The 2 towers in Lord of the Rings,
yeah,
you know,
of course.
That's of course. You know, you got like, I don't know, Rapunzel or something up in a tower, you know, that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, it was kind of fascinating to see the difference between the two, and there is a difference, and it's kind of interesting to see Buehlman with Black Tongue Thief being his latest release, and we know he's working on a prequel, and like he's been leaning more that way. It seems that it'll be interesting to see how his voice and like the tonality that he chooses for each story kind of continues. But he seems like the kind of guy who knows what kind of story he's trying to tell and wants to like tell different kinds of stories. And this one just fit really well into like, I'm going to play it very straight. We're dealing with matters of religion and matters of the like souls of man and all of that. So the setting is the 1300s. So I'm really going to play it as straight as I can. And then in the fantasy, it's like, oh, it can be whatever I want. Let's see how far I can push this. Let's lean into the like fantastical and the whimsy of that, you know, which he does. So there are some commonalities in his attention to like horror details and using that to shock you and push the limits of his themes, which I find super fascinating. But ultimately the vibes are totally different, you know, totally different.
That's exciting to hear, though, that he displays such impressive versatility, because the character
he's a literal Renaissance man.
He is, yes. The character that he's using to be the main character and presumably the point of view character of the prequel to the Black Tongue Thief is one that is a different character than the main character of the Black Tongue Thief. And I guess, I don't know if I would call it a worry that I had, because I have so much faith in Christopher Buehlman's writing ability. But I guess I was thinking, oh, this character's not as funny. That's just not their voice. So I was like, am I not going to enjoy the prequel as much because it's not going to have as much humor? But it sounds like Buehlman has this ability to adapt to different writing styles, and it also seems like you enjoyed it a ton even without that.
Oh yeah,
that element,
because it was just like he played the right cards to fit the story, you know. Like in Black Tongue Thief, he was writing similar story about the you know, pretty much love and companionship and finding meaning and life through that. And in this book, he's talking about redemption, but he knows the vibe that he wants to achieve. Like, he wanted to achieve a very playwright, insult Renaissance guy kind of story with Black Tongue Thief, and then he wanted to portray like a serious, like sermon almost in Between Two Fires. So he's willing to understand, okay, what is the vibe and what is the theme that I'm really trying to hit home, and where through my voice can I lean into to tell that story. And having only read 2 books and seen like the spectrum that he already has shown, it makes me want to read other stories, like ones completely removed from fantasy elements, like his first book that was like super praised and celebrated, Those Across the River, which is a very more modern setting. It's like to see just where he can go. And the fact that he gets almost this like curiosity and this kind of, artistic integrity through shifting the voice makes me appreciate him. Sometimes you think, you want to just call an author an artist sometimes. And Christopher Buehlman is one of those guys where you really just see the intrigue and the passion and the there's something just on an artistic level that he's trying to achieve with these stories and the ambition that he goes to tell them in, that you don't really, especially in fantasy, can be hard to get sometimes. Sometimes in fantasy, a guy thinks up a cool magic system and puts politics around it, and those are fantastic stories. But
his name is Brandon Sanderson, Charles. All right.
yeah. To what artistic integrity, to what statements he's trying to do as an artist is up for interpretation. I think his artistry is just in how big can I take this, how much of a science can I make this? Yeah,
create this massively entertaining story. I mean, I think that's the Sanderson way. Is just like,
yes, but he's like very analytical, and he's creating like laws of writing fantasy in his mind and creating relationships and like scales and things on which he can build entertaining stories and worlds. And I think Buehlman's like, how do I really own the vibes of what I'm trying to achieve? And it's just 2 different approaches, and something about the Buehlman approach gets me excited. And like after reading a lot of like fantasy like we love and we're used to, it's a nice like disruptor in that lineup. And I have to say, like, Buehlman does have a strong audience, because although this book did not do as well as Gideon the Ninth, for like, Gideon the Ninth is just hot right now and is coming out with his latest book this year, but I would say Between Two Fires had the most write-ins for sure. Even if it didn't get the most votes, it had the most write-ins, and I really appreciated that. That's how you know when an author is doing something, because people feel compelled to write you a message directly saying, hey, like this is a great book. I would love to like talk about this with someone, because it just spoke to me on a different level. Like, no one's writing in to say read Gideon the Ninth. It's already a bestseller. Like, there's no one who's championing that. But there were multiple write-ins for Buehlman and for Between Two Fires. So it's just kind of an interesting like difference in approach and difference in style that I'm super excited to continue to watch his career, and I'll definitely be picking up more books from him in the future. And I highly recommend this to anyone that had found any of this even remotely interesting, or maybe read Black Tongue Thief, or maybe read Scott Lynch or Joe Abercrombie or something like that, to give this a try. 100%.
So it sounds like those are the folks who you would recommend this for, because we always try to, in these spoiler-free episodes, get into that. It sounds like fans of Abercrombie, fans of Scott Lynch, and of course fans of Buehlman's fantasy work. Anyone
for
else?
Sure, and fans of like The Witcher, fans of Last of Us, fans of, you can get into the horror, like Stephen King, you can go into that too. But yeah, I think fantasy fans would definitely, like, who are curious about horror, I think this is a good bridge over into horror, because it pulls on enough stuff to like keep you rooted in the familiar, but it pushes it in the horror direction. So anyone even remotely interested in horror that's a fantasy fan listening on this show is worth checking out. But if you're disturbed by horror images, obviously this is not the book for you, because it goes like any horrible thing you could think to happen to a person. And that's funny, there's certain characters where like Buehlman describes hell, and just the creativity of the torture that he describes what people go through in hell is so horrific. You do not want to go there, and then one of the things like,
don't want to go to hell, Charles.
But you're like, oh yeah, hell is bad, all the worst things imaginable. Oh, it's so bad. But then like he describes stuff, and you're like, oh good God, like that is.
I really do not want to go to hell.
Like I knew I really didn't want to go, but this just like reset. Like now I'm like concerned actively. So, it's kind of like, this is not for people with like who are going to be kind of turned off by like threats of sexual assault or torture, or gore, or psychological torture, or any of that. It's all here.
Yeah. Everything
you could think of, every sin you can commit is kind of considered and written into this book. So, that's kind of a little caveat there. But I think we've said it all. It's one of those things that's like, this is such a like fantastic author. It's almost rare to see someone with so much, poetic license to put into telling the story that, I'm just super fascinated. And I'm looking forward to his next release, whenever that may be. I'll be there and I will read it. And maybe I'll pick up those Across the River while I'm waiting, just totally disconnect from fantasy to see what he's up to, see his original book,
Right. Well, you have me fascinated as well, Charles. This is one that I know I will read at some point. The question is only when. And then I guess we'll get our opportunity to dive into this one with more spoilers. But for now, as you said, Charles, I think we've said it all. If you're interested in taking a look at Buehlman's other work, it sounds like a fantastic place to start. And Charles, I think that there's probably not much left to do except to get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping at this point.
I would agree. Let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping. Thank you, everyone, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today and you want to support the show, the best way to do that is engaging with us over on social media. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than engaging with us over on social media, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can now do over on Spotify, where most of you are listening. It's just 2 clicks at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and it helps us so much when you do that. You can also rate and review on Apple Podcasts. That means you can say nice things about me, nice things about Charles if you're so inclined, and that always puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Well said, Dylan. Just listening is more than enough. But you Buehlman fans, write in. You've been great so far. Keep it up. Keep the messages coming. Could talk Buehlman all day, especially spoilers, which I can't talk about, so one day. But until then, guys, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.